For that very generous introduction. I have to also thank Dr. Redenna, who's been spearheading fantastic programs through FABA and his initiatives to bring the whole biotechnology sector in India to greater and greater heights. And then thanks also to Dr. Uday Saxena, who did a wonderful job in terms of really setting the landscape for all of you. Last but not least, I have to recognize that everyone who's decided to be part of this course, guys, you're in for a great time and you're in for some really good learning in an area that's very, very hot and very, very relevant to what the future holds for the next 20, 25, 30 years and more. I'm going to see if I can share my screen and project my presentation.
Yes, you should be able to do that actually. Yeah. Okay.
All right. So, I decided to start talking about Quo Vadis, which actually means where are you heading? And where is biotechnology going? But what I'm going to do is, given especially that we heard from Dr. Uday Saxena on some of the really strong relevances of biotechnology, take a step back and start with where is the world of therapeutics heading? Where is the world of pharmaceuticals heading? Why do we need more and more therapeutics? And especially given that we are in these COVID times, that has brought even more questions to us. But before I start doing that, let me just take a minute to talk about why am I here or why do I think I'm here. I certainly appreciate you all inviting me. I'll just I'll highlight a few things about how career progresses. And those of you who are just starting out in your careers, it should be something that is helpful to understand the diversity that exists in the world of biopharma. So as Nidhi mentioned, I started with my career in molecular probes, which is actually a biotech company, a family-owned company. I then moved to a large company called Monsanto, and then moved to a company called Celera Genomics, which was a startup. And this is a very interesting startup because they were based or formed to sequence the human genome. This is a company that had on the order of 50 sequencers on one floor that was just cranking out genomic data. And today we know how useful that genomic data has become. So little did they know that they, alongside with NIH, were actually creating the foundation of what is going to be very, very relevant today. Because without that kind of information, we would have had a hard time doing the kinds of things that we are doing today from a genomics perspective. I then worked for Amgen, one of the largest biopharma companies, then moved into vaccines with Biologically and Sanofi. What I want to, and then of course now with Syngene, a large CRO, CDMO that operates in all of these spaces, both biopharma, small molecules, GMOs, and so on and so forth. I think what you should take away from this is within the bio industry and to the knowledge that you have in biologicals, you can be working in any or even more diverse fields. And I'll talk a little bit about where even some of these fields are evolving into, such as cell and gene therapy. I'll touch on that in my conversation. The other bit to realize is you may start out working with a certain company in mind or a certain aspiration in mind. Be prepared for that to change. Today, both Celera Genomics and molecular probes are part of another company called Thermo Fisher. Monsanto is part of another company called Bayer. And so in the world of corporates, these kinds of things do change. So set your aspiration, set your direction towards the kind of science that you want to do, not necessarily so much the exact company or the exact role or the exact opportunity that you want to pursue, because things do evolve and we are in a very rapidly changing world. That said, I already covered this, that I'll talk about a little bit about therapeutic approaches, technology, and then the promise of biologics. How do I want to touch on the therapeutic approaches, right? If we think about it, one of the older drugs that we still use today and talk about a lot is aspirin. If you think of that as your wave one, we're today then in wave four. So, aspirin was a very simple small molecule compound whose biology was not as well known at the time, but the drug actually worked. We then got into a wave where we actually said, well, okay, we really now understand that there is a target in the body and a drug that interacts with the target. So let's rationally design something that will actually work for us to make the to interactions better through targeted molecular approaches. The next wave then, which we will talk a little bit more about, is the wave of the recombinant technology, which is roughly something that started in the late 70s, 80s, and today is still very much in its growth phase. What we are moving into now is multi-specific medicines. Many diseases can be treated by targeting a specific protein and changing it in some way, such as trying to block it, activate it, destroy it, so on and so forth. But a single target protein and a single approach may not necessarily be sufficient. And one of the ways to think about this today is, why do we need to think about more and more vaccines when we are talking of COVID? There's a whole lot of change that is going on even with the virus. There are drugs and there are targets that are known as undruggable, which are now being solved. One of the recent drugs that was approved by for Amgen was for KRAS, which was at one time really considered an undruggable target. This is the promise of technology. This is the promise of biotechnology, and which is why all of you who are here should consider yourself really fortunate to be present in this area at the right time. Let's talk about the recent year, or the last 16 to 18 months. What have we heard about? We've heard things like mRNA therapies. We've heard about the need for speed, because we heard that vaccines got approved in record time. When they got approved, then people started talking about, are they safe? Do we have enough capacity to make them? Are we sufficiently utilizing technology? Is what the internal conversation started to be. And ultimately, how do we build confidence? And many, many more questions that have come in this last 16, 18 months of what we've been going through. And I'll try and answer many of those questions, and tell you that the answers to many of those questions really rely in what is being done today within many parts of the whole biotech industry. And this then I use to say, where are these approaches being used? Because when you think of this, and I'm sure you'll cover some of these components in even more depth over the course of your curriculum, but broadly speaking, drug discovery, drug development, and commercialization or commercial manufacturing are the three main buckets of how you can look at the journey of going from, I want to solve something for a disease, and now I've actually put something on the market to actually solve that problem. There's many subcomponents to that. I won't go into depth on all of those, such as understanding the target, the selecting something to actually address that target, then the components of development, which are all of the preclinical and clinical. Then you file your NDA or your BLA or what have you, and then get your product approved, which is when you start marketing, manufacturing, and then doing what we call as phase 4 studies. All of these are very typical dimensions, but in each of these areas, the opportunity to learn today is about, how do we address some of the things that I had on my previous slide? The need for new technology to be applied, such as AI, the need for speed to be brought in, the need for more and more precision or more and more diversity. Let me give you an example of why diversity has become really important. When vaccine trials were being done, if vaccine trials for COVID have considered many different types of populations, such as Asian, Caucasian, Blacks, Hispanics, so on and so forth, those trials have then immediately sort of built the comfort to bring those vaccines or those medicines into the market without adding more and more studies. And so, therefore, designing studies early on with that diversity is your way of addressing the need to have much more data, and also then addressing the need for speed. Of course, you have to balance it with how much data can you generate at what time, what space, and at what cost. This is where technology comes in. And this is a very daunting slide. Let me just take you through some key take home messages on this without trying to read everything on the slide. First and foremost, look at the components in the middle. There is pharma, there's tech, and there's CROs. You'll see there are names that you would not have thought you would see in a biopharmaceuticals or a pharmaceuticals presentation, like Canon, Apple, Oracle. Some of these are pure tech names. What's happening is these tech names are working with the pharma industry side by side with the CRO, CDMO industry and companies like Syngene to actually bring solutions to the market through AI, ML, and so on and so forth. There's about 240 AI companies in which there's about 60 investors and 90 corporations that are all working in tandem to solve different ways of addressing the use of more and more data to solve our problems related to either drug discovery, drug development, or advanced R&Ds. And this landscape is ever changing, right? This is in fact a pre-COVID slide, so you can imagine post-COVID there is many more companies that have been added into this who are just looking, and I'll give you some examples of exactly how these companies are contributing and wanting to bring technology to speed the whole area that we are going through. A little bit of a deeper dive, right? Where are the opportunities for such AI companies to just contribute in drug discovery? Think about it as you have the clinical stages, you have the preclinical stages, and then you have even earlier of that, which is the R&D stages. You can use AI tools at any on all of these spaces. And here are some examples of companies who are targeting to offer such platforms, including the very right-hand side column. If you think and see, you have end-to-end AI platforms also being offered by companies that offer solutions to address, to bring more and more precision and to bring more and more speed and better decision making during the preclinical stages, clinical stages, or even in the early stages of R&D. And so this is how this space on one hand looks very ripe because I put in a lot of names and companies here, but also is ever changing and ever evolving. Let me give some examples as I mentioned. How is AI and ML transforming the biotech industry? Here's an example from AbbVie. How AbbVie is a company that's using AI to speed up and bring accuracy in their clinical trials. As you can imagine, clinical trials are, of course, a very, very important component of what you do during the drug development time. It's very expensive. It's also very important because if you don't get the right data, your drug is not progressing and will never see light of the day. The way they are using AI is to visually confirm that the medication was actually ingested, to confirm that the medication schedule is adhered to by patients, to address the effectiveness of the treatment. All of this they are doing not just by themselves, but also by working with other companies who are specializing in this. And then they are doing this for specifically their phase 2 schizophrenia trial. They actually worked with AI Cure to make sure that this trial was much more well monitored, well adhered to, and therefore the data coming from that trial was much more reliable. This is how technology companies are partnering with pharma biotech companies to bring innovation at different stages of development. Here's another one, and this is more upfront. Gilead. Gilead, which is a company that you may have heard of. If you haven't, then I'll tell you, Gilead has also been very well-received name because Gilead is the original manufacturer of remdesivir, something that was very, very important and continues to be utilized for COVID management. They are using AI to create a disease model. This is literally just to understand whether you can even have a drug against some sort of something like this sort of a model, and to very early on before you even have candidates for it. This is to discover new targets that can influence a disease progression and regression. And this is becoming important in things like they're of course developing this for therapies in a condition called non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. In Syngene, I'll provide another example of how we are utilizing some of these AI-based tools. We are using Derrick Nexus for faster decision making in the drug development process. Yeah, and you have some of the phases of this drug development process at the very top of this slide. Lead identification, lead optimization, candidate selection itself is many, many weeks worth of work, many, many experiments. What we are doing is utilizing a tool like Derrick Nexus to understand and evaluate where you can reduce your potential number of experiments that you have to do by understanding safety and toxicity profile through such a tool, which is an AI based tool. This has a very fast runtime. You don't actually need to manufacture or synthesize the molecule. You can predict multiple toxicity endpoints. And so what you normally would do, for example, say an Ames test or a Herd assay, which tells you about calcium potassium inhibition components, or a phototoxicity assay. Now you try to develop that in silico. Keep in mind, it does not fully eliminate animal testing, because to generate the data package that you have to submit for the regulatory authorities, you still need to do the animal testing. But at the same time, you have had the opportunity to reduce the number of experiments that you're doing upfront by utilizing such a tool. And this tool gets only smarter and smarter as you feed it more and more data, because it is based on AI and it's based on ML. Certainly, it said it helps you from a cost perspective. And as you all know, cost of drug development, cost of the entire process of going from discovery to commercialization runs into billions of dollars. And anything that we can save helps us both from a time and cost perspective. I'll give another example of something that will come later on, because I'll move into biologics very quickly after this. But just to talk about how technology is being used, and where all of you, as you get the knowledge of biologics, biosimilars, you will also learn tools that are going to be useful in day-to-day life, as a biologist, or as a molecular biologist, or as a biochemist. We are using glycosylation. Many of you know that antibodies have glycosylation. There are other proteins that have glycosylation. We are using glycosylation profile management through smart algorithms that are also based on AI/ML. The way they work is you put in the inputs such as temperature, pH, osmolality, sugars, concentrations, so on and so forth. You then create a mathematical model of what actually happens in the cell, which is how the cell makes the glycan. And then you get a plot of inputs and variables to actually modify these concentrations or these conditions that are on the left to get you the glycan profile that you want. And there's almost two ways of working in this. One is you run with the choice of parameters that you have, and you arrive at the input combinations that you want. The second is, if you're already doing some experiments, then you start to sample from the bioreactor or the fermenter. You look at the profile, you feed what you got with the conditions that you put in, and then you come up with the next set of conditions that you actually will use for your next experiment, so that you know the prediction, you know what you will get from your next experiment from a glycan profile perspective. I am not going into every single level of detail in this because for time constraints, but hopefully you get the picture. I should check and see with you, how much time do I have more, before I know that I don't completely blow your schedule. Nidhi or
Oh, it's sure. You have good 18 minutes.
okay,
Yeah.
good, very good. Thanks. So let me now jump into the real biologics market, right? Because hopefully what I did for you is set up two things so far in what I've covered. One is that the pharmaceutical biotechnology space is very diverse, very broad, and therefore getting knowledge about biologics is very, very important and very useful. Second is, more and more you need to start thinking about how technological tools can be leveraged to move rapidly in this market. Before I get into biologics in more depth, I want to show this as a picture, which is actually a figure that is on the campus of a very famous company. So many of you notice I work for Amgen. When I was working for Amgen, the other company that we would always eye is Genentech. So Amgen is in Southern California, Genentech is in Northern California. This is a picture from a meeting that happened in 1976 between Herb Boyer, um, and Robert Swanson. So in 1976, it was a 29-year-old venture capitalist, Herb Boyer, who approached a biochemist at the University of California, San Francisco, and he proposed to develop a market using recombinant DNA technology. So recombinant DNA technology was known at the time. However, it just wasn't being used for therapeutic purposes. Very unusual, right? It's not a scientific person who's going to Entrepreneurs like Derrick Nexus is coming and saying, there is all this promise of molecular biology. Why not use that to create beneficial products? That meeting was supposed to be 10 minutes between Swanson and Herb Boyer, and you can see the casualness that the scientist has to this. Um, Turns out this meeting lasted for 3.5 hours, and that is how Genentech was formed. And this is still there on the Genentech campus, which marks a transition of an idea, not necessarily a technology that existed, but an idea, then to commercialize or to benefit or utilize that technology. And I think this is where today's entrepreneurs, today's new team that you all represent should be looking at. Let me give you a few more reasons on why biologics, why biosimilars. The 2020 global therapy revenue by technology, if you look at it, is roughly around $300 billion. When you see that, and this is the graph on the left that I'm referring to, about 56% of that came from monoclonal antibodies, 9% of that came from vaccines, and then there's a very noticeable 1% that is coming from cell and gene therapy, and 33% coming from other recombinant proteins. So this is how, one, the market is huge. And for those of you who are not so familiar with looking at numbers from a revenue or from a dollars perspective, just translate this directly to number of patients served. Because the more the revenue earned is also, of course, more and more doses or more and more injections that have been used to treat and to cure people. What you see on the right is the rate of growth. And the rate of growth has been the highest for cell and gene therapy, which is why I want to cover that in a little more detail. It has also been very high for bioengineered vaccines and monoclonal antibodies, which was at one time growing the fastest. It looks like it's been growing slower only because some others have been taken up even faster. Takeaway from this message is the biologics market is growing. More and more therapies are coming. More and more newer modalities are coming. And so those of you, again, who are in this business, looking at why am I here? Why am I doing biosimilars? Why am I doing biologics? You have all the reason. And if that was not enough, here's one more. What you see on the left is the generics, biosimilars, biologics comparisons on some of these dimensions of time that it takes, cost that it takes, complexity of process. So you can look at that, and I'm sure you'll cover that even more, especially as Dr. Uday Saxena mentioned, biosimilars and biologics have really a good relationship to understand. But more so, let's move to the middle of the slide. Almost 2/3 of the US biologics market will see a transformation to become biosimilars, because today they are biologics. Tomorrow, as in not literally, but sometime down the line, they will have the opportunity to become biosimilars. And therefore, you taking the opportunity to understand what is a biologic today, what will be a biosimilar tomorrow, is going to be very, very helpful to you. It's also very important to understand this whole business of biologics that are already biosimilars, which is the 19% of the market. And then what you see on top in the right corner is that by revenue, when you look at it by pure revenue, by dollars spent, despite the fact that you have a lot of biologics that have become biosimilars, by revenue, it's the biologics that are making most of the revenue, and biosimilars, there's a huge opportunity to go through because only about 3% of the total revenue is coming from biosimilars. Hopefully the takeaway on this is clear, that you have an opportunity to put more and more energy into biosimilars development. Moving on to other components of looking at the biologics and the biosimilars market is through biosimilars and through biologics, or through biotechnology in general, we are covering more and more diseases. Again, Dr. Uday Saxena gave an example of enzyme replacement therapy, which cannot even be done through small molecules. But many of the diseases we have been used to hearing about have actually been managed by small molecules. And what we are now seeing and what you're seeing here is the breadth of diseases or therapeutic areas that or interventions that are being now taken over by biologics. So again, good reason to be in biologics, good reason to be convinced that yes, if I wanted to make a difference to the world by treating more and more diseases, I know biologics is the way to do that. I'll also show you this, which shows that you have more and more molecules that are coming in to phase one, phase two, phase three, phase four in all of these different areas. And of course, the bioengineered vaccine has taken over the most because of the number of studies being done on SARS-CoV-2. We saw that antibody therapeutics are the biggest chunk of what is being done in the biologics area. Let me spend a few minutes on antibody therapeutics. Antibody therapeutics have actually been growing from the earliest molecules, which were in the early 80s, the antibody that was from orthoclone, which was for a non-cancer indication, to now covering both cancers and non-cancerous indications. So the upper half of the line that you see in the middle has the cancer indications being covered, and the lower half is non-cancer. What you also see in this particular table is there's a lot of the diversity in the even in the non-cancerous indications, which means what I just mentioned on the previous slide, you're actually seeing a lot more of saying that there's so many candidates and so many diseases that biotechnology and antibody therapeutics are addressing. The promise of this is here to stay. The other bit that is worth recognizing is that this industry was about $0.2 billion worth in the 90s. About 25 years from now, from then, we are over $100 billion industry. Tells you that the reach has become even farther. We are covering more patients. We are offering more and more solutions through this particular modality of pure antibodies that are being brought into the market through many companies. And look at the crowding that you see on the number of agents as you move to the right of the slide, saying that we are getting more and more mature in bringing biologics and biosimilars and therapeutic interventions of this nature to the market. We are truly harnessing the power of the immune system and using antibodies to manage that. I mentioned I'll talk a little bit about cell and gene therapy because you saw that cell and gene therapy is one of the fastest growing segments within the whole biologic space. There's really three components on how you should look at cell and gene therapy and understand the science that you will learn in these next few days in this particular course to help you dive in deeper. One is the gene modification component, which is about how do you actually go and change the gene that is responsible, that is somehow not correct and is either responsible for a genetic defect or is responsible for a disease state. Then there is the component of how do you actually get that delivered, which is the payload delivery strategy. And this is where components such as viral vectors come in. I'm sure some of you have heard about lipid nanoparticles. If you haven't, go read up some more on mRNA therapeutics, mRNA vaccines. mRNA vaccines do not get delivered unless they have been put into a nanoparticle way of intervention. And then there is the component of in vivo or ex vivo delivery, depending upon the therapeutic approach that the cell and gene therapy is taking. So in vivo, it's through microspheres. Ex vivo is through CAR T therapy. Some of the newer drugs, which are at the most expensive end of the scale, fall within this category because of the cost of intervention that it takes, and also the fact that there is a very customized approach that is required to deliver solutions from a cell and gene therapy perspective. But it's all based on the fundamentals of what we learn in biologics, biochemistry, drug delivery, viral vector processing, and so on. Give a couple more examples of relevance to our industry on how you can see this playing out in real time. Here's an example of precision medicine working in real time. This is about a sequence of steps that have gone through. So don't try to read every step on the slide. I'll just take you through the fact that this is showing a sequence of steps that covers 37 hours of intervention for a 5-week-old boy admitted in an NICU. What all was done in terms of this particular intervention is genome was sequenced, a gene defect identified, diagnostic tests completed, treatment ordered, and treatment received by the patient so that within 6 hours after that his symptoms were resolved. This is the power of biologics and biological based medicines, genetics, diagnostics, AI, because this had interventions of all of these nature, and of course things that you don't always think about, a very smooth supply chain. So folks, when you are here, when you are talking about and listening about everything that needs to happen in the biologics world, also start thinking about everything that impacts the biologic world from a very peripheral perspective. You may have heard earlier that we had vaccine supplies challenged because of purely supply chain issues, not technical issues, not necessarily good impact on a specific batch, but supply chain. So many different things really need to come together for you to successfully bring therapeutics on the market. I'll give you another example, which is very interesting to me, of what we will see in the future as electronic tattoos. This is a tattoo on the skin being studied where you can have sensors embedded in this tattoo, sensors that can actually detect metabolic signals of, for example, exhaustion. And when it detects a signal of exhaustion through a decline in certain endorphins or through a increase in lactic acid, then it initiates the release of a biomolecule that can stimulate the person. And so, for example, this is something that can be useful in a military or a war sort of situation where you cannot unfortunately afford to have exhaustion take away the ability of the person to come back into a safe area or to continue to be on the field, or stress, and then can release endorphins or a chemical agent can again which can happen in a war situation. So detection, through measurement and immediate intervention, all of that happening in an electronic tattoo. This is where these designs are actually been being happening. Last but not least, I want to very quickly cover the India story on biologics and bioeconomy. The bioeconomy, which components I showed you are things like GM foods, agricultural components of economy, biosimilars, bioservices, biofuels, and many, many more, is about a $70 billion industry, which contributes to about 2.7% of our GDP. So a sizable contribution that comes from the bioeconomy, and propelled and fueled by not just the large companies, but also a lot of startups. There's about 50,000 startups that India has, and about 4,000 plus of them actually are purely biotech startups. So a huge opportunity for us to all look at how we propel this ecosystem through smart talent and through smart approaches of integration between technologies. The target for India is to have about 10,000 biotech startups, and for the bioeconomy to be even more than twice of where we are today. So huge opportunity, huge need for talent that will come for all of you to be able to contribute to this economy and this story. Some more insights on India, and then I'll start to conclude. The knowledge of biologics professionals in India, when you compare with the arrow, is uh, on one hand you can say is less than that of China or of US, for example, on a scale of 0 to 10, a little better than that of China. Now, of course, we need to up this, and this is why you all are studying biologics, you all are studying biosimilars, biotechnology, to make this arrow go up high and get it to the highest that it possibly can be. Another dimension, and this is coming from the CPHI annual report of 2020, if anybody wants to look at that, is from the innovativeness perspective. The innovativeness of the biologics industry is also not where it needs to be, and therefore there's an opportunity for us to all work to bring improvement in the biologics industry from an India perspective. And then the last one is on the quality of biologics processing. I think this is really, really important. Quality of what we do has to be supreme in the minds of everyone working in this particular industry. I do not want us to be faced with challenges around quality of products, quality of materials, quality of equipment that we use in our manufacturing or in services that we deliver. This cannot happen through things like data integrity. This cannot happen through shortcuts. This cannot happen through other means of shortchanging the ultimate product that needs to come. In biologics, more than anything else, process is the product, and therefore following every single step of the process to the last T or the last I that is there in the procedure has to be done, and then you get quality of the product that you have targeted. On the other hand, the growth potential of biologics is actually in India is at par with many other nations, and in fact better than some of the other nations as well, which tells you that we have a large opportunity for all of you who will graduate with and learn even more and more skills to bring the biologics industry to better and bigger heights. I'll close by saying some of the key messages that hopefully you got from this is efficacy of our products, speed at which you bring them, safety of those products, and the cost at which they are brought to the market are all of paramount importance. We learned this no better time than today when COVID vaccines are being talked about. Well, is the vaccine good enough? Is it coming fast? Was the question that was being asked when we didn't have a vaccine. Now the question that is being asked is, well, is it safe? Did we shortchange anything? And the answer is no. The industry has not shortchanged any of those components. Data was generated, innovative approaches were taken, things were done in parallel to not compromise, but and also bring it in a way that it is cost effective. And of course, the government is helping to make sure that the COVID vaccines are brought to everyone regardless of the cost that they are at, because the government is subsidizing and making those available. And so my plug there is, if you haven't taken your vaccine, you've been sitting on the fence, please go take your vaccines. Of all things, the biotech industry needs to be really, really comfortable with vaccines that are there. Ask the questions, but definitely take the vaccines. The other message is, of course, paradigm shifts, tremendous paradigm shifts, where we were with aspirin to where we are with today with Kymriah kind of cell and gene therapy products that are out there. And then biotechnology as an industry has a tremendous potential within that. India certainly does. I'll leave you with this quote from Charles Dickens. At a time like this, when we are still battling the pandemic, you can say that on one hand, it's a season of darkness and despair. On the other hand, there's a lot of promise that lies in front of us and a huge guiding light that can be there. With that, thank you very, very much, both for the invitation and for all of you to intently listen. And thank you in advance for becoming really good biotechnologists, biologists, contributors to the bioeconomy, and bringing really good talent into both the Indian avenue as well as into industry. Thank you.